Hello, welcome to this lecture on the mind of a terrorist. This handsome fellow looking back at you is Gavrilo Princip, and he was a Bosnian Serb nationalist who sought to free Bosnia and Herzegovina from the Austro-Hungarian rule. And he did this by killing the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife by blowing them up. And this ultimately led, as most historians will agree, to the Great War, or as it is known now, the World War I. So he's kind of the OG terrorist when you're thinking about people who really made an impact in the 20th century. Now, some of these are going to be fairly familiar, like the Oklahoma City bombing, which is, I believe, celebrating or not celebrating its 30th anniversary. But the idea of terrorism is when you do something as a political act or a social act. It is defined as an act of violence intentionally perpetrated on civilians, in other words, not a military base, with the goal of furthering some social or political perspective. The Oklahoma City bombing was done by an American citizen, actually by two American citizens, and stands as one of the worst terrorist acts of the 20th century. So that's a sad thing. Then we have the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Kenya in 1998. And what you see here is that terrorism, whether it's in the US or in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, is widespread destruction. We're not talking about a person being taken out by a drone. We're talking about hundreds of people, men, women, children, babies, murdered to get people to pay attention. And that's an important element to this because they're doing this for the attention. And because they need the attention, they need to know that people are watching. And the way they do that is they kill as many people as they can, sadly. Now, when we think about terrorism, we know a lot of people die. But when we break it down, we see that almost 30,000 people have been dying a year. And just in the last couple of years, we see that dip to below 25,000. However, I suspect with what's going on in the Middle East, we're going to see 2024 level out at a much higher number. Now, in terms of why the numbers vary from year to year, well, to a certain extent, some issues get resolved, some issues flare up. It's like a fire. And in certain parts of the world where we saw a lot of terrorist activity 20 years ago, we don't see so much. When I was a kid in the olden days, one of the terrorist hotspots was Ireland because the North and the South were fighting. Well, that has calmed down in the late 20th century. And now what we see is one of these places that people want to go on vacation as, for the beauty of the place. So, someday, hopefully, all of our families will be able to go places that were off limits to a certain extent because of this situation with the terrorist activity. Now, where is it all happening? It's happening around the world. And now these are terrorist attacks by country in 2023. And you'll see Syria, Pakistan, Israel, Congo, which is in Africa, Nigeria, Africa, India, the West Bank, Yemen, Mali, Burkina Faso. And you'll see that you don't have a lot in the US. Well, in 2001, after 9/11, the US put in a series of very controversial safeguards to prevent another attack in the US. Now, does it happen? Absolutely. But what do we see the most of in the US? School shootings. And those are not the same thing as a terrorist, because the school shooter just wants to promote his own identity and his own sense of powerlessness, whereas the terrorist is a much different animal. They are part of a larger group, and they are trying to get things in that larger group that have purpose and meaning to them. Terrorists don't have a special look. The people on the left are your uh, newsworthy Middle Eastern terrorists, and the guy on the right was the one who helped blow up the Oklahoma building and killed hundreds of people, including children. It doesn't matter what your color is, what the shape of your face, if you're tall, if you're short, any of those. Basically, all of these terrorists have one thing in common, and that is an ideology. Now, that ideology is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. Everybody has some sort of an ideology, but it's when the ideology moves to a violent perspective that things get really bad. So, ideology is a system of ideas, beliefs, and principles that shape how individuals or groups understand the world, society, and politics. So, think about it from the perspective of your political party or your religion. So, if you're Catholic, if you're Jewish, if you're Protestant, if you are Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic, any of those are going to define in your world what the rules are for how to engage with the world. These ideas can then be transplanted and viewed through that lens. Now, if you're more focused on things like whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, a communist, a socialist, those are also ideologies that define how you see the world. You know, there are people who truly don't believe that you need a democracy, that an authoritarian leader is the way to go. And again, these are ideologies that are outside of what the United States might look at, but other countries, or such as Russia, for example, think that, you know, having that strong leader and you don't have to do anything and think about anything is the best way to handle it. Those are not always the ideologies we grow up with are not always the ideologies we embrace as an adult. And that's another important aspect, is our young adolescence and our young adulthood define in a lot of ways how we see the world. And if we have very positive experiences, our experiences will be more positive. But if we have a lot of negative experiences, then it seems like the world is against us. And it's hard to shake yourself from that perspective, that ideology. So, researcher Aaron Beck applied what's known as a cognitive model to terrorist ideologies and concluded that the thinking of terrorists evidently shows the same kind of cognitive distortion observed in others who engage in violent acts. So, this concept of a cognitive distortion, they don't necessarily see the world as it is, they see the world through a prism, a glass that doesn't 100% reflect the reality of their experience, but they have a very specific point of view. So these are folks who oftentimes have an all or nothing perspective on the world. Black and white thinking sees people and events in absolute terms. So somebody says, "Oh, I really like Michael Jackson's music." And somebody else says, "Well, I think Michael Jackson was a child molester and I couldn't listen to his music." Well, neither person is necessarily wrong. It's how they see the artist. Some people see Picasso and the amazing political work he did in art, and other people point to how he treated the women in his life. So there's always going to be different perspectives, but there's a recognition of multiple perspectives, and that not that everyone else is wrong and I'm the only one who's right. Am I right there? And in the same vein, either everything is a success or everything is a failure. There's no middle ground. There's no incremental improvement. It's either I failed or I did great. And this kind of thinking really limits how you interact with the world because you're limiting opportunities. And it's also important to note that not all ideologies lead to terrorism. An ideology has to choose to engage. It has to promote it. It has to recruit. It has to look for ways to gather these folks in under their ideological umbrella. The brosphere that we hear about, where it's very anti-female these days. I tried to stay away from the more controversial areas. So I looked at data from 2010 to 2016, 10 years ago. And what you'll see here is we still had a lot of political extremism, religious extremism, and this idea that whites are in some ways supreme. Then we have the Animal Liberation Front, anti-police, anti-abortion, the sovereign citizen. By the way, if you haven't watched Sovereign Citizens in Court on YouTube, it is hilarious. Feel free to take a moment. Anarchists, anti-gun control extremists. They are the folks that will hold on to their rifle in their cold, dead hand because of the Second Amendment. But they don't know any of the other amendments. But that's another story. Anti-Semitic or the anti-Jewish extremists, which we've seen growing tremendously. Just remember, just because you don't like the guy who's leading Israel right now, doesn't mean that all Jewish people are out to get you. And then the anti-white extremists. Again, some groups, and you'll see missing from these groups like the Catholics, the Protestants, various religious organizations. They can be affiliated because of religion, but those groups, those official groups, are not pushing people to engage in terrorist activities. So when we look at extremism versus terrorism, you can be an extremist. You can be someone who is outside the abortion clinic every single Saturday with signs and trying to get people to not have an abortion. You're an extremist, but you're not necessarily a terrorist until you take it to that next step of violence. Being an extremist means you deviate from the norm. What is most people doing on a Saturday morning? Sleeping in, watching TV with their kids. But, being an extremist is not necessarily a bad thing. When we look at the various and sundry extremists of the past, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., these are folks who had to go to extremes to get equal rights. So extremists are people motivated by idealism, and they're not necessarily violent. They are supported by rallies, leaflets, propaganda from sources that contribute to their cause. Can be motivated by a variety of issues, from animal activism to feminism to ethnic and religious commitments. And it's tolerated by society. We see people go out and demonstrate all the time. They're going to Washington, they're going to Philly, they're going to New York, and they want their voice heard because this country is a democracy. Now, terrorism takes all of that and adds violence. So this violence is no longer something that people who don't engage in this terroristic rhetoric will tolerate. And so, more than likely, they are trying to separate themselves from what they perceive as the sheep, and they want to demonstrate how much they're committed to a cause. And again, just because you're committed doesn't mean you're a violent person. But when you become a violent person, you become a terrorist. So researchers have identified 3 common motivations that drive terrorist activity. The first is injustice, then we look at identity, and then a sense of belonging. And does it sound a little bit like being a teenager? Well, yeah, and that's when they get young people, because they're going to help them figure this all out. So we're going to call these the markers of vulnerability. And we're going to start off with injustice. When a person perceives an injustice, there is a natural desire for revenge. I mean, we learn this from a very young age when we see cartoons and one person gets bopped on the head and then the other person's going to chase them. Um, Vengeance is a very human feeling, and it can become an obsessive drive that is powerful and moves a person to violence. Then we have identity. And this, again, going back to this idea of adolescence. An individual's psychological identity is developed, which evolves into a stable sense of self and security in one's basic values, attitudes, and beliefs. An individual's exploration of identity may draw them to a terrorist organization in a variety of ways. So when we look at identity, and again, those ages of 14 or 15 to 26, so important, because that's when you are looking for your identity. You're looking to achieve a firm sense of self. There is the idea of achievement, where you've gone through a crisis and you've come out better on the other end. Then the idea of an identity foreclosure. A person may or may not have gone through a crisis, but has chosen an identity they can identify with. So, if it's your parents who say, we think you should do this, or your best friend's doing it, so you're going to do it, you basically are giving your identity to someone else to figure out. Then you have your identity moratorium, which is when a person is going through a crisis and has not yet chosen an identity. And this, to a large extent, describes most teenagers. We're figuring it out. One year we're goth, the next year we're preppy, the year after that we become the gross person eating glue in the back of the room. Doesn't matter, because we're figuring it out. Then the last part of this identity development is the idea of identity diffusion, where a person is avoiding the identity crisis or feels they have no or limited choices to make. And we see that coming in terms of the next marker of vulnerability, which, we're going to be looking at in terms of, what do you have to look forward to in your immediate environment? So some individuals define their identity simply through group membership. A person's identity is fused with a group identity with no sense of individuality. It's, the mean girls from the movie. It's the cheerleaders. It's the dancers. It's whatever clique group you want to look at. They all kind of blend into one person. The other individuals need to understand why they exist. A defined meaning that pushes an individual to adopt a role to advance a cause with little thought to its value. So if you're thinking about, again, high school or even junior high, somebody that you might have been good friends with before puberty, puberty hits, and suddenly now there's awkwardness and weirdness, and that awkwardness and weirdness makes one person become super athletic and isolating themselves, and the other person becomes very dark and writes poetry and, thinks about crows a lot. The point is that we're figuring it out and we haven't taken an identity yet. Now, when we choose to adopt a cause, and again, it can be any number of things. You find out how much plastics are getting into our brain and you want to get rid of plastics from the single stream recyclers, or you want the world to go back to using milk that's not been pasteurized. Okay. This becomes prevalent in individuals whose circumstances limit their opportunities to find success. And that's really where it comes down to. These folks are not sitting in their mom and dad's beautiful house with mom and dad's beautiful cars and all that other stuff. These are folks who are living in economic or socially deprived areas. A lack of opportunities leads to feelings of being marginalized, not being part of a group, and a lack of identity. Belonging. For those of you who've been through psychology, I hope you know the Maslow's hierarchy of human needs has its center. It's the one that you really need as an adult, is that love and belonging. The first one is your physiological needs, your food, your drink, your somewhere that, warm clothes, those kinds of things. Then your safety and security, having somewhere to sleep at night, having someone that keeps you secure as a child, those kinds of things. So then you move on to love and belonging. And this sensibility is where the terrorist group really grabs you. And this is also true for cults. The affiliation among individuals provides them with a sense of belonging that we all crave. We are part of something bigger than we are. This is critically important as a motivating factor for joining a terrorist group and staying with the group. Individuals find a sense of community within a terrorist organization. That sense of community cannot be underestimated. Even for those of us who want to stay home and watch TV, it's if there's people out there who care about you and want to spend time with you, it's very, very alluring. Ideological development is the process that shapes how individuals and societies view the world. So how do we get there? How do we go from being our slacker 12-year-old to someone who eventually becomes a terrorist? Well, exposure to ideas. You have to be exposed to the ideas, whether that's at the street corner or in your classroom, your church, online, social media. And that, unfortunately, is where a lot of the bad stuff happens. Reflection and assimilation. You kind of think about it. You look at it. You say to yourself, I think this really reflects who I am, and I'm going to become part of this group. That then solidifies the formation of your core beliefs. If you belong to an organization that truly believes a certain group of people are evil, you are going to have to assimilate to that and become that belief. Evolution or radicalization. And that means that you become radicalized. You see the value of terrorist activities. And then finally, the application and action. You're going to go put a bomb somewhere and do it for your political purpose. It doesn't always sound like it's this simple. It's not, because there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of peers, there's a lot of expression in the world that is influencing how they see the world. So, who's out there doing this recruitment? And it's in places where people feel deprived and dissatisfied. People who are younger are seeking older role models who won't disappoint them, who are like the people they see in TV and movies, and they are looking for, their own mentor who will lead them to the right way to live. Effective recruiters create and exploit a sense of urgency. If you don't prepare for this, the apocalypse is coming and you're all going to die. The transition into becoming a terrorist is rarely sudden and abrupt. It's over time. It's, we're going to invite you to the spaghetti dinner, and then we're going to talk to you about our beliefs, and then we're going to show you how other groups have tried to undermine our beliefs, and why these other groups are terrible people, and why we have to fight back. This is a quote from researchers. What we know of actual terrorists suggests that there is rarely a conscious decision made to become a terrorist. Most involvement in terrorism results from gradual exposure and socialization towards extreme behavior. So it's that gradual exposure more than anything else that has that impact. So next, we're going to look at the developmental pathway to terrorism. And this is this stage of the process. So the first process is that early socialization. The bigger kids are all involved in this particular activity. And then something happens to you, and that affects your life image, your self-esteem. And they come and they comfort you. And then other events occur, interactions with the police, interactions with another group. And again, those folks that are trying to recruit you are going to support you and offer you a shoulder to cry on or the empathy that you crave. And then finally, that personal connection to a terrorist group member, that is going to have such a significant impact. And again, we go back to that idea that we're all looking for a mentor who's going to help us figure out this complicated life. Hofstede is a researcher whose work focuses on the factors that shape organizations and their cultures. His work can be applied to terrorist organizations. And what he says is there's a certain 5 specific activities or ideas that represent the cultural pathway to terrorism. Power distance, the power, the authoritarian leader. This is not your guy's going to sit down with you like the Dalai Lama and have a conversation. You're not talking to this person. They're far away from you. Individualism is frowned upon. Instead, they want you to be part of the collective. And in certain countries and cultures, this is far easier than in others. Masculinity, and this is almost across the board, has to be hyper masculine. This sense that women have ruined the world and undermined a man's place in the world, and that appeal to that masculinity is vital to the next step where they look at violence. Uncertainty avoidance. So uncertainty avoidance means how willing are you to take risks? And when you think about your average 16 or 17-year-old guy, they're way more willing to take risks than, someone with a wife and kids and a house and a car and all that other stuff. So they're looking for people who are willing to take risks. Younger men are the ones who are most willing to take risks. So you'll see the parallels are absolutely glaring in this. And then that long-term orientation. Young people, they don't think about 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. They think about next week, next month, maybe next summer. The idea here is they're looking for people who are looking for short-term satisfaction because the long-term hasn't even begun to appear to them. They don't see their lives as long. They see their lives as short, sweet, and they want to get something done. Now, there are some personality characteristics that you tend to see in terrorists. They have a general sense of mistrusting just about everyone else. They hate passivity. They don't want to go march. They want to blow stuff up. They themselves were probably abused physically. They were beaten, or they grew up in an environment where that kind of behavior was punished by more violence. Emotionally humiliated, especially if they felt humiliated by women. A woman who's a romantic partner, a mother, a sister, even a neighbor could set them off. And then finally, dreading the violation of their psychophysical boundaries. When we are engaged in a relationship, whether it is with our parents, our spouse, our children, we have to have the give and take. They don't want to do that. They want to keep their physical boundaries close and their psychological boundaries close. They don't want to share and learn about other people. So, psychological elements that validate terrorism, this is in their minds, it's not actually validating terrorism in any way. Diffusion of responsibility. And we know this from sociology, where the bigger the crowd, the less likely someone's going to step forward to help someone, because you don't want to feel like you are in charge or responsible for somebody else. And there we go with our displacement of responsibility, which we saw after World War II when Nazi soldiers attempted, unsuccessfully by the way, to defend themselves by saying they acted on orders from an authority. And then you have de-individuation. It's easy for me to say, occurs when people are not seen or paid attention to as individuals. They lose their sense of self-awareness and consequently their inhibitions and restraints. If you are the youngest of 11 kids, you completely understand this. You are just another kid in this giant household. And in some environments, that's how you are seen. Especially if there's been war in the area that you grew up. You are no longer an individual. You are somebody whose family is trying to protect you from a war. So we look at the factors on what gets a person to stay, but there's also factors that get people to leave. This guy, Nasir Abasa, is a reformed Al-Qaeda linked terrorist in Indonesia, and he has become a comic book author in a series that chronicles his transformation from villain to ally in the fight against terrorism. So we know people leave a terrorist sect. Why? Well, it's a lot of reasons that sound very familiar to why we leave in relationships. Experience a profound disappointment due to personal failure or disillusionment. When you discover that the guy, the boss man, the leader is corrupt, that will oftentimes sour a person on an ideology. The killing or imprisonment of a family member or friend. If you went into this activity with your buddy and your buddy got murdered or was used as suicide fodder, that's going to change how you see things. Being introduced into a setting where terrorism is a long-standing tradition or a response to a current political crisis. If your dad was a terrorist, your uncle was a terrorist, your grandfather was a terrorist, well, it's very much like having a family business. They're going to have expectations. In the same way, that could easily pull you in. A lot of people can tell you that the last thing a person wants to do is join the family business. And as a consequence to that, they get the heck out. Contact with a group that influences the way in which a person sees and evaluates a political situation. So if we're watching TV and we see that Hamas attacked Israel, they took all these people as hostages, and then Israel attacked back. That's the short version. But there's other versions that are much more politically inclined towards Hamas or Israel. The reality in all of this is what media you get your news from. For those of you whose grandparents love Fox News, you will get what I'm saying immediately. Other people, the only news they look at is what pops up on their Google News feed. Other people might have a subscription to the New York Times or Washington Post. But how we get our news is how we interpret the politics that are going on around us. While membership in the group meets personal needs, with terrorist activities, one of the conditions one has to fulfill for membership. So you need to be violent to be part of this group. And for some people, that might be a bridge too far. One of the big ones we see are suicide attacks. And we usually associate suicide with hopelessness and depression. The desire to end intense and agonizing psychological pain motivates the person to kill themselves. Well, terrorists use suicide in their attacks, typically associated their own death with martyrdom. This is the idea that when you do this to affect political change, you're going to end up in paradise, and your family will recognize your heroic sacrifice. And depending on, the particular sect that we might be looking at, that the 40 virgins in paradise is one option, or your family being a given, a free pass to paradise. There's a lot of things that go into it. The suicide attacker is usually supported by his family and friends and is seen as brave. So he's being encouraged by his group, his political group, his family group, and at that point, they see it as the best way for them to get to paradise. So just a brief comment about the leadership, and this is Osama bin Laden, who organized the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. So what does an effective terrorist leader have to do? They have to maintain this collective belief system. And one of the things about Osama was he came from a billionaire family, but he lived in caves. He was going to sacrifice himself. So he was, to many of these people, the real deal. Establish and maintain organizational routines. He's a man who was well educated. He understood the concept of systems. Control the flow of communications and manipulate incentives and goals for followers. If you were able to do X, Y, and Z, you would be elevated. You deflect conflict to external targets. This guy and this guy hate each other. Okay, go shoot an American. Direct ongoing strategic operations, and that's really where their true intelligence comes in, is they are incredibly smart individuals. The leader is dedicated but not delusional. They're not crazy. They're not the ones who are shouting terrible things as they dive into a crowded marketplace. They are not mentally ill. They can read people and they can appeal to their needs. So all of these items that we discuss here, you have to have that leader, that charismatic leader who brings people to the fold, just like a cult. And like many cults out there, you can in fact have that situation where you can convince people to do violent activities that they would never consider doing in this quest for religious ascension, so to speak. Last but not least, we have some research if you want to learn more about this. If you have any questions, please drop me a comment, and I hope you have a fantastic day.